last installment of the GTO court, we laid down our final judgment on the G-Man vs. Lew case, dismissing it for lack of evidence. But some in the poker community were not satisfied with our judgment.
How dare you!
And continued to assert Robbi's guilt on Joey Ingram's most recent podcast. First up was Poker Jesus, who brought forth new evidence of an alleged signaling scheme involving Robbi, Rip, Eric Person, Nick Vertucci, the dealer, and the shooter on the grassy knoll. Apparently based on a whopping sample size of 10 hands collected by some random trolls on the internet, which is always the best source of credible information, whenever one of these players points with 1 or 2 fingers, they win the hand. According to Charlie, he plugged this very quantifiable information into his life solver and reached the conclusion that the likelihood of all this being a coincidence is 0.001% with a 99% confidence interval. Joey, I think, did a good job playing devil's advocate, showing instances where they used the same pose but lost. In response, Charlie, on the one hand, welcomed contrary evidence, but seemingly at the same time was dismissive of the counterpoint based on the idea that any sophisticated cheater will intentionally not win 100% of the time to avoid detection. And while that may be true, the issue is that you can apply that same logic to dismiss almost any conflicting piece of evidence that is contrary to your narrative. Joey also raised the point, if these were signals for cheating, why would they use something so conspicuous over and over? Why wouldn't they mix it up? Maybe they could shuffle chips in a particular way, for example. Also, you have to wonder why they would need a signal in the first place. If the theory is that these people are signaling to someone in the back room to provide them with info on whether or not they're ahead, wouldn't it just be safer to leave it to the discretion of the person in the back room to feed them that information without any obvious signaling? Charlie also alluded to the fact that every single high-stakes pro he's talked to on the matter agrees that Robbi cheated during the Jack-4 hand. And this is a sentiment that others have expressed as well. If so many pros are convinced that she cheated, shouldn't that be convincing evidence of guilt? Well, let's consider that proposition for a moment. If we're talking about how to construct a c-betting strategy on a monotone flop in a 3-bet pot, or on game selection or bankroll management, sure. The opinion of someone who has made his living from playing poker absolutely should carry a lot of weight. But is the same true when analyzing the thought process and behaviors of an amateur who has been playing for only a year recreationally? You could argue that a high-stakes pro who has been playing for many years against other high-level pros and is at the pinnacle of his craft may actually have a skewed perspective of Robbi's behavior, who is simply not a part of that same world. Having played for years in LA card rooms myself against a variety of recreational players, I can tell you that they will often make such outrageous plays that it will make you question how they manage to survive life to grow into full-grown adults based on the judgment and decision-making that they display on the felt. And even if you wanted to appeal to authority like this, 2 of the greatest players of all time, Phil Ivey and Dan Negreanu, believe she's innocent. And Ivey was actually there to witness everything firsthand. If anything, the opinion of these 2 should carry more weight than any other person on the planet. They've been playing for a very long time, mostly in the live environment, and have seen it all. This is in contrast to many of the pros who think Robbi's guilty, who made most of their money 20 tabling online in their basements while pissing in Gatorade bottles. Jungle Man also came on the show, apparently high on shrooms, to express his views of guilt, citing many of the pieces of information that have already been discussed ad nauseum in the past. Jungle dismissed many of the measures taken by Robbi to prove her innocence, including by saying that her passing the lie detector test, arranged by her own PR team, should be given 0 weight, which is a view that is held by many others. And while it is true that polygraph exams are not foolproof and have questionable validity, to say that they should be given 0 weight, in my opinion, is an overstatement, especially coming from people that are pointing to things like vibrating anal beads and hand gestures as proof of guilt. To this day, no one has brought forth a single shred of evidence regarding the mechanism of how the cheating actually occurred. Polygraphs are used by many legitimate organizations, including law enforcement, national security agencies, and insurance companies. So even though the results should not be used as definitive proof of her innocence, it's only fair to give it some weight in the mosaic of evidence that has been presented by both sides. And I think this highlights one of the major issues with the public discourse on this topic. It seems like many of the loudest voices have simply chosen a side and are now filtering all of the evidence that's uncovered through that lens of innocence or guilt, instead of weighing all the evidence equally and objectively like a true investigation should. should. For example, probably the most compelling evidence of Robbi's guilt is the fact that Brian stole 15K of chips from her stack, and Brian is someone that has whole card access and a shady past. Admittedly, this single piece of evidence is very probative, and it nearly shifted my personal view from innocence to guilt. However, when adjudicating any case, you can't have tunnel vision. You need to weigh each piece of evidence against others that may contradict it. So, for example, Robbi mentioned that there were possibly other instances where Brian stole in the casino, and Ryan Feldman, who later came on the same podcast, confirmed that although there was no solid proof of that, he admitted that there are theories and opinions of Brian doing various nefarious things in the past that in hindsight should have raised a red flag. It's not crystal clear what he means by this, but it seems that there is some truth to Robbi's claim. Other contradicting pieces of evidence include the fact that Brian did not claim the 250K bounty, and also the fact that, at least according to Robbi, she's pressing charges against him and handed her phone over to the authorities. Ryan also elaborated on how Brian actually stole the chips, which I thought was interesting. According to Ryan, this was after the show was over and Robbi was on the floor talking to someone. It was at that point where Brian was in the card room, apparently by himself, and he saw the chips unprotected, thought the stream was no longer recording, and swiped the chips. Based on that description, maybe this was just a situation of a scumbag that saw an opportunity to palm a few chips from a drunk recreational and he took it. Next up on the stream was Matt Berkey, who mostly talked about his brewing feud with Nick Vertucci. Matt has been very vocal about the security issues he sees with the Hustler stream, and apparently this has really gotten under Nick's skin, who lashed out at Berkey, threatening to publicly disclose the fact that Matt recorded a phone call he had with an HCL employee, which apparently is illegal. In my opinion, this was a bit of a passive-aggressive, underhanded move that was just designed to get back at someone who Nick thinks is unfairly attacking him. But while Berkey's criticisms of HCL are relevant to the poker community as a whole, Nick's jab back at Berkey is really just a personal attack that doesn't really have any relevance to furthering poker and appears to be more of a case of a personal vendetta. That being said, at the end of the day, I don't think these two are that far off in terms of what they believe needs to be done going forward. It seems they're both in agreement that tighter security is needed, and according to Ryan, HCL is taking major steps to that end. It seems that the primary disagreement between these two is whether the current system is so corrupted that you simply cannot hold a legitimate game until the system is fixed. I personally am not a gaming security expert, so I can't really opine on the degree of risk in the game, but since both sides agree that there are some issues, hopefully it's something that can be addressed sooner rather than later. Berkey also mentioned that he's still on Team Guilty, though his position seems a bit more nuanced than the others, leaving some room for innocence. In Matt's opinion, it is simply impossible to rationally explain the Jack-4 hand, which, when coupled with the security issues, makes him lean towards guilt. But is it really impossible to explain the hand in a legitimate way? Although it's been analyzed to death, most of the analysis has been through the lens of guilt or through nonsensical clickbait, so let's see if we can justify her behavior from the perspective of innocence. So we're joining the action on the flop, which is 10-10-9, 2 clubs, giving Garrett a straight flush draw and Robbi jack shit. Garrett bets around 37% of the pot and Robbi calls. So if Robbi had the ability to know whether or not she was ahead at this point, I think you would have to question why she would make this call in a very marginal spot with just some backdoors and an over. Yes, she has higher showdown value, but Garrett was a heavy favorite to win with his combo draw. I suppose you could argue that she called because she knows that she can steal the pot on later streets, but that same logic would seem to apply to all the hands she played on stream, and yet she only VPIP'd at a relative mediocre rate. If she had some type of clairvoyant advantage, you would think that she would play more hands than that, and if she's selectively folding any hands, this would probably fall in that bucket. So I think overall, this initial call on the flop actually weighs against guilt. The turn is a 3 of hearts, and Garrett bets nearly full pot, and then Robbi min-clicks it back. Again, if Robbi knew G-Man's cards at this point, you'd have to question why she would make this move, which is really designed just to fold out air, not a combo draw. Why not just call and then wait for the river to see if G-Man makes his draw, and then bluff him off if he misses? That would seem to be the rational thing to do if you had some type of cheating system. So Garrett shoves, and Robbi takes a very long look at her cards, and some have used this as proof that she did not misread her hand. But is she actually looking at her cards? Why would it take her a full 10 seconds to do so? This length of time suggests that she was not just checking her cards, but was actually lost in thought contemplating something else while in this pose. I know that personally I've looked at my hand to check suits only to be distracted in thought and then had to recheck my hand again literally 10 seconds later because the cards didn't actually register in my brain.
Three's no good?
This, to me, is the absolute best evidence of her actual state of mind during the hand, as she had Jack 3 the hand immediately prior. As I mentioned in the last video, it is well established in Western jurisprudence that contemporaneous utterances carry more weight compared to subsequent statements because it is much more difficult to fabricate lies on the spot in high-pressure situations compared to after the fact. Some have suggested that this was some type of false signal to make it seem like she was trying to elicit a reaction from Garrett, but if that were the case, why would she claim to have a 3? Why not a 10, which is probably what you would say if you actually want to elicit a response?
I call.
She calls?
So you have to ask the question, if there was some elaborate cheating system that they had arranged with an inside man, why would they choose this hand to cheat when it would undoubtedly raise suspicions, right? It's been established that she did lose a number of hands during the stream and her VPIP was modest. So if you assume she was cheating, then you would also have to assume that they were being very selective with respect to the spots to cheat in. If that was the case, this would probably be the worst fucking hand to choose, especially since it was essentially a toss-up. Many people are hanging their hat on cheating because there's no rational way to them to call with Jack high in this spot, but it is also irrational to cheat in this spot as well. They equally do not make sense. However, Robbi believing that she had a 3 and calling, and then lying about it later because she was embarrassed, to me at least, is much more plausible.
Yikes.
Great. Okay.
You have pocket 3?
What?
No.
No?
No, I just thought this is a pure bluff catcher I'm dealing with right now.
So someone asks if she has pocket 3s and she replies no, and then someone else quietly asks if she has a 3 and she says no again. Some have pointed to the fact that she answered no to the second question as proof that she didn't misread her hand, but it seems equally plausible to me that she was still answering the question of whether or not she had pocket 3s. Pocket 3s would not be a bluff catcher here, but a bare 3 would.
We'll go to the river. The river is a 9.
That one's you for sure.
They're gonna run it twice.
I
And
don't think so.
she's
You have
gonna.
like small pair?
You give me that much credit?
I don't know.
Haven't you seen what I've
She's
done?
good with the first one.
So the 9 rolls off on the river, double pairing the board, and Robbi's expression seems to be grim. G-Men then asks, "I think this one is you," which she replies, "No, I don't think so," which is exactly what you would say if you thought you had 3x that was just counterfeited. Garrett then asks, "Do you have a small pair?" and Robbi implies that she doesn't, which is another piece of evidence that people use to prove that she didn't think she had a 3. But is it possible that when Garrett says small pair, in her mind it registered as small pocket pair? I've seen plenty of other people confuse these terms before. Additionally, if she was deliberately pretending to misread her hand, it doesn't really make sense why her story would change multiple times. Robbi may not be a rocket scientist, but the reality is, if she was sharp enough to pretend like she had a 3 based on her having Jack 3 the hand before, you would assume that she has enough brain power to maintain that deliberate lie over the course of a couple of minutes.
And the river breaks out again.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Wow.
I want to see. Does she have Jack 4?
The second river is an ace, and it appears that Robbi doesn't like this card, which would seem to coincide with the idea that she thought that Garrett had ace high, as she would later claim, perhaps ace x of clubs. But then Garrett turns over his hand, and you can see a change in her posture. She realizes she won, and victoriously turns over her hand while saying in an almost condescending manner, "Wow, Garrett, how many times are you going to let me do this to you?" Now, many have pointed out that after she flips over her cards, she doesn't jump out of her seat in surprise, which proves that she knew she had Jack high all along. But let's imagine for a second that she actually did think she had Jack 3, won a massive pot against the GOAT, and just triumphantly threw out a bad bitch one-liner, only to realize that she fucked up and misread her hand. Carefully watch her expression right after flipping it over, and tell me if this is the face of someone that just won a nearly 300k pot, or someone who is mortified and frozen with embarrassment for misreading her hand in front of two of the best players in the world and tens of thousands watching at home live on stream.
She got 4 jackpot.
What?
Whoa!
Look at
What the fuck?
Whoa, look at Garrett's face.
That's some fucking poker right there.
That was sick.
Wow.
That's true. That was sick.
Oh, shit.
That is super.
Now, just to be clear, it's not the judgment of this court that Robbi has proven her innocence. That is not the role of this court. But the idea that there is no rational explanation for this hand other than cheating is simply not true. It all depends on the lens through which you view it.